Hi, I'm Carl Herzog, public historian for the USS Constitution Museum. When construction began on USS Constitution in 1794, it was expected that the purpose of the ship would be to defend and protect U.S. shipping interests in the Mediterranean. American merchant ships had been getting seized by corsairs from the Barbary states of North Africa for quite some time, and the American public had reached a point where they were ready to fight against it. But while shipwrights were busy laying up planks and frames for Constitution in Boston, diplomats and politicians were busy attempting to resolve the issue in the Mediterranean and confront another issue that was coming up in the Caribbean. By the time the ship was launched and prepared to sail, the issue in the Barbary States had been temporarily at least resolved, but Constitution's new and first conflict would be against the nation of France. At first glance, it can seem a little confusing that France, America's staunch ally against the British in the American Revolution, would be a threat to American shipping. After all, the Treaties of Alliance and Commerce had been the first international agreements that the United States had ever signed, and had been in part designed specifically to foster trade. But France in 1797 was a very different country than it had been in 1778. In the intervening years, a violent revolution had swept through the country, replacing the traditional monarchy with a new republican government that had a very different view of the world. The French Revolution can make the American Revolution seem like a pretty tame and civil affair. Unlike the American colonies attempting to throw off the yoke of overseas oppression, the French Revolution bubbled up from extreme hardship from within and produced a radically different kind of republican government. Over the course of 10 years, they had swung from a traditional monarchy to this new republic that now seemed ready to overthrow every other monarchy in Europe. And as a result, war had reignited between France and its old nemesis Britain, who was now joined by a loose coalition of other European countries that felt threatened by France. When this War of the First Coalition, as it became known, began in 1792, the United States declared its neutrality. America had been working to establish itself as a trader on the global stage, and at the time was eager to continue to be able to trade with both sides in a neutral state. Peace with Britain after the American Revolution had led to some prosperity, but trade between Britain and the United States was still on some hedgy ground because there were a number of issues left over that were left unresolved from the Treaty of Paris that ended the American Revolution. Chief among these was America's continuing inability to trade with remaining British colonies in the Caribbean, which had been a central market for American colonies prior to the Revolution. To resolve the outstanding issues with Britain, America began negotiating a new treaty in 1794. For Britain, better relations with America meant that they didn't have to worry about the United States compounding the threat from France. The resulting treaty did a number of things, but among them was to open the door for American merchants to trade with British colonies in the Caribbean. The resulting treaty became known as the Jay Treaty, named for John Jay, the diplomat who had negotiated it. And it went into effect in 1796, just as Congress was debating over suspending construction of 3 of the 6 frigates that were beginning to be considered no longer necessary as a result of the diplomatically resolved issues in the Mediterranean. But although the Jay Treaty smoothed over relationships between Britain and America, the United States still saw itself as a neutral country when it came to the war between Britain and revolutionary France. The Americans argued that the overthrow of the French monarchy had essentially canceled America's military obligation to side with France and defend it against Britain. Keep in mind that at the time, America was fiercely divided between 2 very polarized political parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. They had very different ideas about the role of the federal government and how that should manifest itself on the world stage. Although there had been general support for the French Revolution as a democratic republic in the beginning, support began to erode once France went to war with Britain and Europe. The parties were divided over how to respond to this conflict and whether it would mean that America was going to get drawn back into another war with Britain. American merchants were eager to trade with all sides, and American slave owners began growing nervous when revolutionary France outlawed slavery. The Republic of France, however, saw the Jay Treaty as a repudiation of America's earlier treaties with France. If American merchants were going to trade with France's enemies, France was going to treat them like enemies. French privateers began seizing American merchant ships carrying British goods from British colonies out throughout the Caribbean and along the American seaboard. In response to these ongoing seizures, the United States suspended repayment of Revolutionary-era war debts that were still owed to France, moving the two countries closer to war. In an effort to diplomatically resolve the dispute, American President John Adams established a bipartisan commission of 3 American diplomats who would go to France in an effort to meet and negotiate with the French Foreign Minister, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand. But over the course of several months, once they got to France, the American diplomats struggled to even meet with Talleyrand in person. Instead, they kept getting put off to a group of intermediaries who were making all sorts of demands for loans to France and other concessions, including a large bribe to Talleyrand, before they would even begin official negotiations. It was unclear to the Americans whether these French negotiators were even representing Talleyrand or the French government in any official capacity, or whether the French government was even serious about pursuing peace if this was the kind of treatment they were giving the Americans. But the politically divided group of American diplomats couldn't agree on how to proceed, and eventually, after several months, they all returned to the U.S. empty-handed. President Adams feared that the diplomatic failure was going to push the nation into war, but at the same time, he recognized that there was a need for some defensive measures. In reporting to Congress, he initially refused to turn over the original dispatches from the diplomats, but when he was forced to eventually do so, he redacted the names of the French negotiators who the Americans had met with, replacing their names instead with simply the letters W, X, Y, and Z. As a result, the entire episode immediately became known as the XYZ affair. The details in the dispatches describing how the Americans had been treated created a political firestorm in the U.S. Insulted over how the American Commission had been received, most Federalists were now convinced that France was not going to back down and were ready to go to war. President Adams, however, still refused to request a formal declaration of war. Despite this, Congress went ahead and authorized attacks on French privateers threatening American shipping, and authorized the construction of 12 new ships, including the completion of the 6 frigates that were still on the ways. America never formally declared war against France, but in 1797, America did go to war against French forces, mostly privateers, that were seizing and threatening American shipping. In the meantime, through a series of back channels, American diplomats continued to try and negotiate a resolution to the conflict with France. As a result, the conflict remained a limited war or a partial war, a war against the pirates as it was known at the time, or as it would later be labeled, a quasi-war. But quasi or not, a war to defend seagoing commerce meant having ships. And without a substantial standing navy, this initially meant assembling a makeshift navy of mostly converted merchant vessels that could patrol the U.S. coastline. However, as the first newly constructed ships of the Navy, including USS Constitution, became ready for service, the Navy was able to take the war to the enemy in the Caribbean. As a result, the quasi-war with France became not only America's first international conflict, but the first naval conflict abroad and the first deployment of Marines abroad.